System, and so hope everybody can see it okay. If not, please direct your criticisms to Mark Goad, okay? And I'm sure he'll be glad to entertain whatever comments. Poor Mark, I tell you, that man has worked and worked and worked. So yeah, so clearly don't say anything negative to Mark, okay? If you don't like it, tell Devin, but tell Mark how wonderful it is, okay? Whether it's true or not, just for your own safety, just tell Mark how wonderful it is. So we appreciate all that Mark's done in this regard. So hope you're having a good week. Andrew, will you lead us in a prayer right quick? We'll get started. Okay, in this section of Genesis for 2 or 3 chapters, God tells us a little bit about Isaac. Isaac is interesting to me. Of the 3 patriarchs, and I'm not counting Joseph as one of them. Joseph we probably know as much about as anybody, but Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the ones that are recognized by the children of Israel, by the Lord, and Isaac's the one we know the least about. He lives longer than his dad. He lived longer than Abraham did. But we really only know of 2 or 3 events that are recorded in his life. We know about his marriage to Rebekah. We know about the birth of his children. We know about the things that take place here in chapter 26 when he has some interaction with the king of the Philistines. But when you get right down to it, we just don't have a whole lot about Isaac. And I find that kind of fascinating. I don't know what to make of that necessarily. I probably shouldn't make anything of it. I don't know if it's because Isaac was just kind of a solid fella and there's just nothing, didn't get himself in trouble a lot, had a fairly strong faith. God's not constantly trying to reassure him. Or the other end of the spectrum, as I've gone through this again in studying and preparing to teach this section, there's some things about Isaac, especially when you consider Rebekah, that kind of make you wonder whether Isaac was as solid as his father was. And so give some attention to this. The first curiosity is we're really introduced to Isaac's life as far as the focal point in chapter 25. We've been through most of it. But even in chapter 25 where we learn about Isaac, who is it that has the real attention of the story in chapter 25? Huh? Yeah, it's Jacob and Esau. I mean, we learn about Rebekah's barrenness and then we learn about her pregnancy, but most of that is focused upon these 2 sons who become very significant in the Bible story. I mean, Jacob and Esau, we probably know as much about Esau as we do about Isaac when you get right down to it. And I find that pretty interesting. And the fact that in the Bible story, you have a lot of reference back to Jacob and Esau. Of course, Jacob, for the obvious reason, he's going to later on become Israel, and it's his sons who are the 12 tribes. But Esau becomes very prominent as well, and that's where I want to begin. We talked last week about Jacob buying Esau's birthright from him, and that's really where we finished up Sunday morning. I want to go back to the lesson before and to the last question. What is meant by the phrase, Esau despised his birthright? And you find that really in the last verse, and then it is mentioned again in Hebrews chapter 12. In fact, in many ways, I think Hebrews chapter 12 helps explain to us what God means by that. Generally, when we despise something, what does that mean? Huh? We dislike it. We hate it. It's actually a pretty strong word. It's not just that, I don't care for it. If you despise something, to me at least, it carries the idea of hatred. I'm not sure that's the idea here. It's not so much hatred, but what comes as a result of hatred. How do you treat something that you hate? Like I hate liver. If I came to your house and you put liver on the table and said, this is what you get to eat at my house, I'm going to throw it on the floor or something like that. I mean, when it's something you despise, your reaction to it, in all seriousness, is one of not just, when you despise something, your reaction, I don't have anything to do with this. I'm complete disregard. And that's the concept here. What is meant by the phrase, Esau despised his birthright? The idea is, not that he was ambivalent toward it, but he had absolutely no regard for the significance of it. And we've already learned in this chapter, and I mention this because it's going to come to play as the story unfolds. We are told about Jacob, about Esau back in verse 27. He's a skillful hunter. He's a man of the field. Jacob's a mild man. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game. And the picture that's painted of Esau is kind of this, rogue, outdoorsman, no regard for people or things of importance. And yet Jacob, on the other hand, is a man who's more given to not just domestic affairs. It's not only that he's a man who lives in the tents. In other words, he doesn't prefer to sit inside in the shade instead of outside in the sun. That's really not the idea. Rather that he's a man who is more conversant, a man who may be wilier and wiser. That concept is there. Whereas Esau's just, hey, I want to hunt, I want to fish, I don't want to mess with anything else. Leave me alone. I'm just going to live life. Now that's the picture that's painted. And we see that in his despising of his birthright. The first example, he sells his birthright for a bowl of beans. Because it just was insignificant to him. At least at this point in his life, it's insignificant to him. And that's why the Hebrew writer uses Esau as an example of someone who has no regard for God, no regard for spiritual things. Not that he's wicked, per se. He's just, the phrase that always comes to my mind is, he's just earthy. He just doesn't think beyond his five senses. And so I want you to see that picture that we are given of Esau. Now they're not going to come to play very much in chapter 26, but next Wednesday when we get to chapter 27, all of this is going to come back. But chapter 26 is going to play into it as well. Andrew, you want to say something?
I don't necessarily agree with everything you said.
Well, you can be wrong. It's fine.
I know.
Sometimes you just need to realize how wrong you are.
To me, when I look at this and then look at Hebrews, it's not so much that he hated it, he just didn't put enough value.
That's what I mean.
When somebody's doing lip service in this worship assembly, it's despising that birthright being a Christian.
No regard. No appreciation of the significance. Yeah. And that's why it's an interesting word. I'm not disagreeing with that. I think the word, it's not that he hated it. He just had no real regard for it, which is what we do with things that we despise. Chris, was it your hand? Dennis? Yeah, no, that's the idea. Yeah. Look around. 99 out of 100 people in this world are Esau. And that's the way I think we need to see it. I think that's part of the reason he is portrayed the way he's portrayed. Not that he wasn't that way of his own volition, but I think that's the reason that God gives some focus to what happens with these boys. Jacob and Esau, Paul mentions them a couple of times as examples in Romans. They're examples of God's choosing based upon his choice as opposed to our activities in regards to God's grace. And we'll come back to that later on. But they are examples that are noted several times. The Hebrew writer, especially when he gets to chapter 12, and he's trying to dissuade the Hebrews from going back into Judaism because it was a here and now thing that they had embraced. It was all the pomp and circumstance and the traditions, and basically that whole chapter is, look, we've got a spiritual home, a spiritual future, a spiritual priest, a spiritual sacrifice, and you guys are like Esau. You're just going to sell your soul, for a bowl of red beans. And so I just want you to appreciate that. That's kind of where we left. Let's move on to chapter 26. This is a fairly straightforward chapter. I tried to isolate it in our study, mainly because what the big point of this chapter is God extending His promise from one generation to another. Okay? And I want you to kind of think about that as we go along through this particular chapter. So hopefully you've already looked at it, read it. It begins with the famine in the land. And so the first question is, where is it that Isaac is living as this chapter unfolds? Not where does he go first, where is he first? Do what? Not yet. Now this is where he goes in the chapter. My question is, where was he? Yeah, Be'er Lahai Roy, and which is an interesting, and I think we touched on this already when we talked about Hagar. If you were going to put it on that map up there, and it's not really in a good place on that map, can you switch to the other map, Mark? Is it close? I don't know that one's going to help us anymore. Go back to the other one, Mark. Sorry. If you go on this map and you go from Sodom, and if you went straight west towards the Mediterranean Sea, the Great Sea, where that red line runs down to Egypt, there's a highway, a main trade route, not an interstate, but it would have been for them. And somewhere down along about where that line turns would be the city of Beersheba. Okay, Abraham spent a lot of his time there, and Be'er Lahai Roy, Lahai Roy, was probably somewhere along that road. History states that it was kind of in the way of Shur, the wilderness of Shur, which is the area, that lower red line that goes down into Egypt, goes across the land of Shur. And it's a remote area, it's a wilderness area. It was a fairly dry area except at certain times of the year. And so for someone who is a herdsman like Isaac was, that's kind of where he settled. Far south, actually, of where Abraham, most of his time in his later life is Beersheba on up to Hebron. Hebron is not on that map, but it would be up close to Kirjath Arba in that realm. Can everybody see that okay? And so Isaac's living farther south than his father did. Now the question, and this is the reason I asked the question, is what's ironic about where he lives? And this may not have made any impression on you. I just found it interesting. Where do we first learn about Be'er Lahai Roy? Do what? This is where Hagar went when Sarah ran her off, when she went off the first time, and she was pregnant with Isaac's half-brother that Abraham wanted to be the seed, and she goes there, and God appears to her, angel appears to her, as she is beside a well, on the way in the vicinity of Shur, on her way back home to Egypt. Remember, she was an Egyptian woman. And so this is where God appears to her. She's the one who actually names the well. I just think it's interesting that Isaac's the one who ends up living there. Even though she was, the whole reason she's with child is because Abraham and Sarah are trying to accomplish God's purpose in ways that God didn't want to accomplish it. I don't know why I find that ironic, but that's the answer that I was looking for. What's ironic about his choice? Because that's where Hagar and Ishmael, where God appeared to them and basically said, I'm going to take care of Ishmael. Isaac ends up living there. But, number two, where did he take his family? Now, Phyllis, your answer is?
That's the answer that's in the chapter. You're asking a bunch of questions that are not in this chapter.
Do you see number one where it says, where did Isaac make his home? And in parentheses, see Genesis 20. I've covered myself on that one. Okay, I am covered, baby. Okay, number two. Having left Beer Lahai Roi, which is in see Genesis 25, you get to chapter 26, where does he take his family? And I'll give you another opportunity. Where did he take his family? No, he didn't take his family to Egypt. You said it a minute ago. Gerar. He takes his family to Gerar. And so you look there in verse 1, he goes to Abimelech, king of the Philistines in Gerar, which actually is a move back up towards the north. Again, now it is, do flip the map here, Mark, if you don't mind. It is on the other map, huh? Yeah, it should be, well, if you look at Gaza, Gerar is kind of where the P in Philistines is. Well, the insert's this big. You're sitting right up front. You can see it. You know, okay. All right. Tracy, it's on the insert on the other map. Hey, Mark, put back the other map. Because Tracy told me to. Okay. Look on the insert. All right. You see Beersheba. You see Gerar right next to it. Everybody see that? Okay. Thank Tracy for your knowledge of the geography of where Gerar is. Huh? You can't see it? It's at the bottom of the insert. Do you know what the insert is? Everybody understand the insert? Here's the insert right here, over here on this end. See Beersheba? You see something that's kind of red and blurry next to Beersheba? Just to the left of Beersheba, there's something that's red and blurry to you. That's Gerar. Okay. All right. Can we all tell school has just started? Okay. If you went back to the other map, most people are familiar with the Philistine cities. Gerar is south of Gaza, okay? But far north of where Isaac is living, which says that this famine had to have been to some degree kind of regional. So he moves farther north because he's a herdsman, and that's evidently there's places to pasture there. Plus there are wells of water there. So he goes to Gerar because there's a famine in the land, and then God warns him about what? Don't go to Egypt. I want you to see this. I may have mentioned this previously. Egypt is always a temptation for God's people in the Old Testament. It's just always, Abraham, you know, when there's a drought in the land, he first goes to Canaan, he goes to Egypt. Obviously, Isaac is entertaining going to Egypt, or God wouldn't appear to him and say, look, I know you came up here, and I know it's not much better here, but don't go to Egypt, okay? And you're just going to see this repeated. The only person that's really told to go to Egypt is Jacob. When Joseph goes down to Egypt, God has to appear to Jacob and say, it's okay, go on to Egypt, don't be afraid. Which I find kind of interesting because his dad and his granddad were told, don't go. So he's really the only one that goes because it's time to move them from Canaan so that they can spend some time away from the Canaanites. But at this point, God tells him not to go down there. And so he tells him at this point to dwell in the land. And this is going to be number 3. What's ironic about his choice and God's warning, and that's really the answer. The irony is that's where they always want to go. All the way through the Old Testament, when the Babylonians threatened the children of Israel, both the northern and the southern kingdom, well, the northern kingdom when the Assyrians come, they look to Egypt for their deliverance. God's really frustrated with them over and over and over in the Old Testament because they're always looking to Egypt. And so it starts all the way back with their ancestors. And so here is, you know, Abraham had a very powerful family, 318 trained servants, so you know he had a bunch of folks. Isaac has inherited this clan. And so there's a bunch of folks, I don't know that we think in these terms. It's not just Isaac and Rebekah and their 2 little boys. Okay, he's responsible for tons of people and tons of animals. And so he moves them all up into the region of Gerar, it had to have been quite an enterprise for him to try to determine, how do I take care of all these people? How do I take care of all my herds? And I think that's why the temptation. Egypt could have become a very permanent place. Remember, the children of Israel went into Egypt as shepherds into the land of Goshen, which is in the Nile Delta, which means there was always pasture because of the annual flooding of the Nile, and it could have easily been a permanent place for them. And they would have lost their identity. And so that's the reason for God's warning. And at this point, God makes what promise to Isaac? This is the beginning of verse 3. Yeah, you get a repetition essentially of the Abrahamic promises. From one generation to another, dwell in this land, I'll be with you, I'll bless you. Okay, it's not just the land, seed, and nation promise. I'm going to bless you. To you and your descendants I will give all these lands. So at this point they have to be, you know, these men are becoming conscious of the fact that this promise is not going to happen perhaps in their day. The Hebrew writer makes that very clear. That they weren't looking for the promise in their day, that they dwelt in tents because they knew the promise was coming. I'll perform the oath I swore to Abraham. I'll make your descendants multiply as the stars of the heaven. I'll give your descendants all these land. In your seed all the nations shall be blessed. Now here is the interesting thing about God's promise to Isaac. Why does he give him this promise? Because of Abraham's obedience. Did you catch that when you went through the chapter? Verse 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. I don't think this means necessarily that Isaac didn't, but the original promise was an unconditional promise. It really, God doesn't tell Abraham, if you're faithful, I'll bless you. He's going to tell the children of Israel that later on. But the promise to Abraham was an unconditional promise. This is what I am going to do. And Abraham's response to God was one of faithful obedience, but the promise wasn't really revolving around Abraham's obedience. However, as the promise is noted, what's underscored to Isaac and then later to Jacob is, you know, Abraham was very faithful to me. And so I'm going to keep doing what I promised him I was going to do. And I want you to appreciate the kind of man that he was. Children of Israel are headed to Canaan when Moses is writing all this down. How important would that concept be? We've made this point over and over and over. And yes, I am belaboring it on purpose. Because their faith in God is really wrapped up in this story they're being told. They don't even know God's name when Moses goes to them. They know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there were stories existent about their ancestors. But were there this many details? I would find that highly unlikely. But it's possible. But their faith in God is being built as God is revealing this, as Moses is writing it down. And they're seeing that God is continuing to keep His blessings mainly in reference to the fact that He made that promise to Abraham. And it should have the same kind of impact on us. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There is no shadow of turning. He is not a God that's limited to time. In fact, I made a note down here a little bit lower. In man, one of the patterns you see throughout the Bible is that when generations change, faith fails. You see, the children of Israel came out of Egyptian captivity. They were very faithful people because God fed them every day. They saw God's power. They went in, defeated the land of Canaan. But what happened when Joshua and Caleb and all of the elders that outlived them died? Anybody remember? The end of Joshua, beginning of Judges. The next generation was not faithful. Okay? And you see it. How many times will you see parents who are very faithful, but their children aren't? You'll see a congregation that's extremely active and faithful and vibrant, but as the leadership turns over, they might not be in the next generation. And one of the patterns in the Bible is that faith rarely persists from generation to generation. Generational change is a huge threat to faith. Here's what's interesting. In God's world, when you look at man, generational change impacts faith. When you look at God, generational change never negates His promises. And so to the children of Israel, 400 years after God's made these promises to Abraham, what they're seeing is God made the promise to Abraham, God made the promise to Isaac, God made the promise to Jacob, God fulfilled the promise through these, 175 and 180 is 355 years. God kept these promises all the way into Jacob's life. Just because we're 400 years after Abraham doesn't mean that God's not going to keep these promises through us. And that's powerful. At least it's powerful in my mind. That it doesn't matter. People say, well, the Bible's ancient, it's dated, it's out of touch with reality. One of the things you learn in the Bible is God not bound by time, so don't think of Him the way we think of everything else regarding time. If He makes a promise, whether it was yesterday or 10,000 years ago, God doesn't look at things that way. He's still faithful. And that's one of the lessons that I get really from this chapter and the promises that are made here in these verses. Okay, number 4. What problem does Isaac encounter while he's in Gerar? Yeah. Yeah. He's got a beautiful wife, and he's concerned that they're going to kill him because of that, which gives you some insight into the people dwelling in the land of Canaan. Okay? Now, Isaac's got 318 trained men in his household that can go whip an army of 5 city-states. But he's scared to death if he goes to Gerar that they're going to kill him and take Rebekah as his own. I don't know if that's a lack of faith. I don't know if he's just not thinking it all through. It's kind of interesting to me. I would make this application for that because I think it's fit and appropriate to us. Faith has to do with a lot more than just whether we're going to go to heaven. You know, we think of faith in God as, well, I trust God that He's going to forgive my sins, take me to heaven. Well, what about faith in His promises to comfort us? What about faith in His promises to answer our prayers? What about faith in His promises to provide for what we need in our life? You know, what about faith in His promises about consolation, about unity and the product of unity in Ephesians 4, that we all work together to help each other become more like Christ? All of those things demand faith. In fact, I would argue it's a whole lot harder to have faith in God's promises that He's going to provide for me than it is to have faith in God's promises that He's going to take me to heaven when I die. I know a lot of people believe God's going to take them to heaven when they die. But they don't believe that if they seek first the kingdom of God, God will take care of everything else. And they don't seek first the kingdom. And so Isaac's faith is tested in regards to, is God going to take care of me? Is God going to provide for me? Is God going to protect me? Andrew, are you trying to say something? Or are you just playing with the pew? Okay. teaching class kind of like being an auctioneer. You have to watch and figure out who's bidding and who's just scratching their ear. So, what was Isaac's solution? Yeah, same thing as Daddy did. Where do you think he got that? Remember, he was pretty close to his mom. We learned that already when he was young. Don't you know, Sarah said, man, you should have been there when we went to Egypt. Would you believe Pharaoh took me into his harem? And he's looking at his mom going, really? You must have been a knockout, Mom. How old were you when that happened? Well, I was 90. Well, that was actually when Pharaoh. She was 65 the first time. So, he knows that's what's happened. And so he pulls the same stunt with Rebekah. Only this time, it's not a half-truth. With Abraham and Sarah, there was actually a half-truth there. She really was Abraham's sister. But Rebekah is not that relationship. They are first cousins, once removed. So that's why the episode should be familiar to us, that he resorts to his dad's tactics. What happens with it, I'm sure you're familiar. Abimelech at some point, and we don't know that Abimelech was the one who was interested in taking her. That's really not stated. He's more worried about the men. But Abimelech sees them, him showing endearment, whatever that is. And Abimelech calls him on the carpet. She's obviously your wife. You wouldn't be treating her this way. Don't you understand if one of my men, if one of the citizens here had slept with her, it would have brought guilt on us, which is kind of interesting. That's the reason for number 5. Abimelech charged his people, saying, he who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. This is pretty much a thought question. Why is this important to the story? Okay, it says that there was some knowledge of God. That they weren't entirely wicked across the board. Both of the kings, the Abimelech that Abraham dealt with and the Abimelech here, which were probably descendant's son, grandson, they make reference to God or to guilt. Okay, so it's not an entirely wicked place yet. It's going to be that way 400 years later when the iniquity is full. Okay, what else do we learn here, Dana? Yeah, the promise of God. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to bless him who blesses you and curse him who curses you. And in some ways, Abimelech becomes a protector to Isaac and his household. And so charges all of his people, don't mess with this guy. Which is pretty important because the next question is, what does God do for Isaac? And in the next verse, what does it say? He what? Yeah, became wealthy. But look at the next verse. Look at verse 12. What happens? He plants a crop and reaped 100-fold. During a drought. Any of you ever farmed? You ever reap 100-fold? Do you appreciate how, I wouldn't say impossible, but this is not the norm. It's nowhere close to the norm. Galen grew up in the part of the world I grew up in. Can you imagine a cotton farmer, dry land farming, reaping 100-fold? That's like planting and getting, 10, 12 bales to the acre when you never put anything into it. I know a guy that made 4 bales to the acre years ago and made $4 million on one crop. Imagine 100-fold. Okay, now here's why that is important. In the next verse, he began to prosper. God blessed him. They began to prosper. He continued prospering until he became very prosperous. You think the word prosper is significant in that verse? Prosper, prosper, prosper. What would ordinarily be the case of an outsider coming in and prospering like that in a man's kingdom? Huh? Well, I'm talking about from Abimelech's standpoint. Yeah, don't you know Abimelech's going, nobody else is prospering. We're we're going to tax you, buddy. You know, you're getting rich at the expense of our landowners, our water, everything else. But what has just happened? What has Abimelech just told Isaac and his people? Nobody's going to touch you. Okay? And so what does God immediately do? He starts blessing him and prospering him. And he's already got to be a wealthy man. But verse 14, he had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants. And the Philistines envied him. And so we get to the next few verses and we see some of the conflict that begins to take place. What prompted the ongoing conflict between Isaac and the Philistines? Well, the first thing is what? The first reason that there's a conflict is what? Because he's prosperous and they envy him. What's the second reason? Because his daddy had done the same thing. Abraham had come to the land. And remember, Abimelech took Sarah and then gave him back and gave him a bunch of gifts. And Abraham settled there, dug a bunch of wells, prospered in their land. You know, don't you know that this Abimelech knew about Abraham? Knew about this family, and here they are eating up all our natural resources, pasturing their flocks on our land, and they're prospering and nobody else is. And so they're stopping up the wells that his father had dug. And that becomes a recurring problem. And I don't know how much time we're looking at here, but it is mentioned in verse 15. It's mentioned again in verse 18 that Isaac is going to go back and redig those wells, and when he does, the Philistines come stop them up again. And so, I mean, think of this from a business standpoint. You're conducting your business, somebody else is out here constantly thwarting you. Only you're not subject to the laws of the land. You've got enough people in your household to fight an army if necessary, and the Philistines are already scared of you. You know, what would you do? You know, if somebody's stopping up your well every time you turn around. Would you just walk away? I do think I see in Isaac at times some degree of confidence in God. He does not put himself in conflict with the Philistines. Number 8, there's another group mentioned. They may be the same. I just think it's interesting that there's two different groups mentioned. Who else is mentioned as a problem? Yeah, the herdsmen of Gerar in verse 20. So this may be more, this either the people that work for Abimelech or these people that are living in the land. And I think the point being, Isaac went there, God prospered him, but he saw conflict all around him. Everybody around him is kind of against him. They're scared to touch him, but they are against him, and they quarrel over verse 21 or verse 21 well, and so Isaac just leaves it, and they dig another one, and then they quarrel over that, and finally he goes to Rehoboth and digs a well there, and the quarrel kind of ends, and moves over to Beersheba, and what does God do? Huh? He appears to him and says what? Yeah, I'm gonna take care of you. Okay? Yeah, I'm the God of your father Abraham. Don't be afraid. I'm with you. I'll bless you. I'll multiply your descendants. And once again, for my servant Abraham's sake. Notice the emphasis still on Abraham. And so they dig a well. Incidentally, when we get over late in the chapter in verse 32, his servants come in and say, hey, we were successful in digging that well, which just happened to coincide with a visit from Abimelech. In number 10 in your questions, what relationship does Isaac develop with Abimelech? Well, Abimelech finally comes and says, we can tell that the Lord is with you, verse 28. So why don't we have a covenant? Make an oath that you're not going to do us any harm, and we promise not to do you any harm, which is the exact same covenant that a previous Abimelech had made with Abraham. Abimelech is a title, like Pharaoh or Caesar, okay? So this is probably a son or a grandson or a usurper to the previous Abimelech in Abraham's life. But they make the same covenant, and again, the irony of this is the Philistines start off as the only people in Canaan that the children of Israel have a covenant with. Well, the patriarchs. They're not the children of Israel yet. And they end up being just mortal enemies before it's all said and done. But that's fascinating to me. So the last question is, how does the chapter end? And this will play into Sunday's study. What's the last thing we're told? Yeah, we're right back to Jacob and Esau. Now, the interlude in chapter 26 is God's with Isaac. He appears to him more than one time. He's taking care of him. He's blessing him. He's prospering him. But the story very quickly shifts back to the kids because of the unusual circumstance that we find in them. And so at the end of the chapter, Esau's 40 years old, which means at this point Isaac is how old? 100. He has Jacob and Esau when he's 60. And he takes 2 Hittite women to be his wife. And we're told that they are a grief of mind to Isaac or Rebekah. We are not told why. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because it's going to come up in the next chapter. Okay, so Sunday we'll be in lesson number 13, Jacob, Esau, and Isaac. Okay, thanks.